it shows you that there continues to be repeated opening of space for political entrepreneurs of all different types. People thought this was locked in, and it's been unraveling.
Across Western democracies, the old establishment parties are falling apart. People aren't just exhausted by politics, they're hostile to it. Welcome to the Rabble Report. Today, we're going to unpack that with Tietze in our episode on populism versus anti-politics. I'm Grant.
I'm Joe.
Tad, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on, guys.
So, Tad, you sort of wanted to come on to discuss populism, and there were a few sources we were looking at for that, particularly this new book on left populism by Anton Jäger. Do you want to sum up what got you interested in talking about populism, and then we'll dive into that?
Yeah.
Or actually, maybe I should have you introduce yourself first.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Tietze. I tweet as @dr_TAD, and I've been co-running and now running by myself a long-standing blog called Left Flank. And I come from a kind of a Marxist, Trotskyist, or unorthodox Trotskyist background, but have long since left that behind. But the thing that happened on the Left Flank blog over a long period of time, starting in the 2010s, was the exploration of Marx's critique of politics and how that applied to what's happening in terms of political breakdown and the constant political crisis and chaos that we see. And I'm going to mention, and I'm also going to mention being writing a book about this called The Great Derangement, about the rise of anti-politics. Come from a Marxist kind of background and have become more and more interested in the question of why modern liberal democracies seem to be falling apart in terms of their political system, why political crisis has become the norm. And really, to tie in with today's episode, the main way that that's talked about, I think, in the official political discourse and the academic discourse is the rise of populism, more often the rise of right-wing populism. But this is like sort of the master narrative in Western and other rich liberal democracies, I think. Obviously personified in the figure of Donald Trump above all. Almost all the definitions of populism that are running around are ideological definitions. So has Muda, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, a Dutch political scientist who has sort of become the preeminent theoretical expert in political science academia on the question of populism and more recently of right-wing populism. That's kind of been his area. And he really describes populism as this sort of ideological appeal or ideological style the populists make. And there are many other theories of populism, like conflicting theories. There's entire books written on all the different theories of populism that are running around these days in the past. But this is the one, I think, particularly because Muda's been quite a good self-promoter and got tied up with The Guardian during the high Trump first term era where this was on everyone's mind. And so his kind of theory is like more out there than just amongst academics. And it's kind of a useful theory because you can kind of define the style of politics and you can see how someone even like J.D. Vance kind of almost consciously expresses that theory, you know, where J.D. Vance talks about we've got better democracy here now in the United States because President Trump is enacting the will of the people rather than the will of, a political elite or the Washington consensus, in the Washington, D.C. consensus or whatever. So you can see how that's quite a useful definition. What it's got to do with populism as it used to be, sort of, going back, over 100 years, whether it be the populism so-called of the Narodniks in Russia, which is like a very different phenomenon, or whether it be early populist, sort of agrarian-based populist movements in the United States in the early 20th century, actually got very little to do with that beyond this kind of ideological style and this talking about the split between the people and the elite.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because I was thinking about that reading Jäger's book, which I want to get to later, but the first use of the term populism, and he was right to point this out, actually, comes out of the need to have a shorthand descriptor for the People's Party, which was, again, it was a 1880s, 1890s political party and movements for farmers in the United States.
Yeah.
Eventually, it winds up getting vacuumed into the Democratic Party and a little bit into the Socialist Party of America. But it was actually a fairly major threat to the political order.
Yep.
In the late 19th century. It was also repressed too. There's a long history on that. We can even do an episode on that at some point. But
it's one of those phases of the United States where the two main post-Civil War parties have to absorb some sort of challenge to their control of the system. So you can see how they do that through a mixture of repression and taking up some of those themes.
Right. And I think too, like what is notable is that there was a social based, like you did have this mass organization of farmers, grangers, et cetera, to, again, challenge the party system, challenge rail companies.
Yep. And I think this social based question is really, really important. The late blogger, the Piping Shrike, wrote an article that I think you guys mentioned in one of your recent episodes on unpopular populism. And I think the point that he was making was that the new populism we have now, while there's stylistic overlap, today there's no popular base in the same way. There's no movement in society that these populists represent in that classic mass party sense of the 20th century, where there are social interests that organize themselves and they gain representation in the political system. You don't have that at all. In this case, you have more a case of the populist actors looking for some kind of votes from different blocks of the population by using populist appeal. So it's kind of an upside down version of it, where now the political actors are searching for that. And it's important to say that because I think populism is only one example of a much bigger process. Is actually, that's exactly what the mainstream parties that are failing are trying to do. They're trying to coalesce votes. When technocrats get into power, like Macron, they try to coalesce votes from different places without, it's not like there was a grand movement in French society that elected Emmanuel Macron in the first go. There was a collapse of all the major players apart from Le Pen's party, who were still too far outside the mainstream. And so Macron gets elected by being this kind of semi-outsider who can mop up all those votes. But it's not like there were people on the streets, Macron leading demonstration. You don't get any of that sense. Just suddenly Macron comes in and fills this vacuum, because his appeal, which was not classic populism, had elements of populism, certainly in the rhetoric, had elements of technocracy, we need a government of experts and of people who are morally correctly, he had a whole book about it, morally correctly centered to be able to renovate French politics. So you see all these different examples that are not this pure politics, a pure politics of populism, taking advantage of this particular much larger phenomenon. And again, each of these cases are an unpopular X, an unpopular populist, an unpopular technocrat, there's a whole book on techno-populism, would you believe, talking about the similarities between technocrats and populists and their rhetoric and how they view the split between society and the political elite. And it's actually a reasonably, insightful book in some ways. There's all these different examples. And then, of course, there's the classic example of the unpopular legacy establishment politician and all the maneuvers they do to try to fill vacuums, overcome their past weaknesses, and so on. So we've got this, and so this is all part of what really is part of the bigger phenomenon, which is the growing volatility and sort of crisis-ridden nature of all politics at all times in these incredibly rich, highly developed countries in which social problems seem to be so small compared with 100 years ago and yet politics is a complete and utter mess. Whereas 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, people lived much tougher lives. There was much less wealth in society. The poor were much less looked after. And yet you have the situation where politics, the same two parties keep winning 80 to 90% of the vote every election between them. Here in Germany, obviously, the two main historic post-war parties, the Social Democrats and the Coalition of the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union, which is the Bavarian sort of version, they can't even get 50% of the vote together. And they were at risk, if it wasn't for the exclusion of some smaller parties because they didn't meet the proportional representation tally, there was a risk that they were going to have to govern with a third party to be able to have a majority in parliament. But because of the exclusion of these smaller parties, it kind of makes it easier. Even if you get less than 50% of the total vote, you have more than 50% of the seats. So, this is a much broader phenomenon than just the rise of the populists. If I could say one more thing, many of the people who are called populists, you have to start to wonder why they're even called populists. And part of it is because people don't agree with Castle-Lutter's definition, because to argue that Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn were populists in some way in Britain, which is the implication, for example, in Jäger's book, or even on the right, Matthew Goodwin and Roger Eatwell's book on national populism. Actually, there's very little classically populist or even modern populist, even though there's the occasional appeals to populist ideas, which you guys are being such fans of Peter Mayer as I am. He's written quite interestingly on this very question.
So he even mentions that. He even mentions that Tony Blair has populist dimensions to him, and it made me wonder. There is kind of a universal appeal to sort of populist ideology, and even more, I guess, establishment political parties and political campaigns now, because there has to be.
Yeah,
it does seem very different from, even when it comes to the people that are generally termed populists now. The way I tend to think of them is as political entrepreneurs, really, versus what was populism in the late 19th century, which really was, that was an example of, I guess, that's actually a very classical example of late 19th century social movements relating to politics. And it's very different.
It's dramatically different. I think that political entrepreneurs is an excellent way of thinking about it. I agree with Mayer that there was a populist element to Tony Blair, and there was a populist element to the Tony Blair equivalent in Australia, Kevin Rudd, who definitely mobilised anti-political theme, but in a much more technocratic way. But there was a certain sense that he was going to be the tribune of the people, even against his own party. And I think if you think back a little bit more generally, it's Margaret Canavan, who was a big writer on politics. I think she's still around, but her key works were in the 1980s. She argued that actually populism is inevitable in any liberal democracy, because in a liberal democracy, there is a tension between the will of the demos, the democratic will of the people, of the populace, and the various liberal institutions that make that democracy stable and able to hold itself together. So there's constantly, and in a sense, deliver liberal rights for the population as well. Deliver their rights to free speech and political engagement and so on. And she argues that populism is therefore inevitably baked into, and in that sense, it's not necessarily even pathological, though obviously many current writers on populism see it as a pathological some kind of like tumor growing on what proper liberal democracy is. But I think Canavan's right. She's essentially saying there is this tension there. What we can talk about maybe later after we talk about, or while we talk about Anton Jäger, is this a tension that simply needs to be written, or is this a tension that is so problematic that actually it causes breakdown of that system, and perhaps something needs to be done to overcome that tension, not just smooth it over, not just mediate it, but perhaps this tension itself is going to cause further breakdown.
What got you into the Jäger book, actually? What drew you to it?
Okay. Well, it's actually a slightly personal story, so I'll plug the fact I have a contract with Verso to write a book on anti-politics, and I had finished the second draft and sent it literally days before coronavirus collapsed on everyone, and which clearly would have made the book require lots of rewriting. So I'm working on a revision currently, and therefore I've been trying to look at, on both the left wing and the right wing side, what people have been saying about populism, because compared with the beginning of 2020 when I finished that draft, the populism discourse was big, but right now it's completely hegemonic. Like, everyone just talks about right-wing populism. And of course, a lot of people talk about it as if right-wing populism is really just the preloading for fascism. So this is like just the common sense now, I think, amongst people who are politically engaged. And even now, more than ever, the populists are calling themselves populists. I think, probably having J.D. Vance as a intellectual type doing the intellectual expression of Trumpism, which is much more, performance art kind of, or stand-up routine kind of intervention. You can see that they're starting to talk about themselves in that way and be more conscious about saying there is this tension and we're the ones resolving it by expressing the will of the people directly. So I thought it'd be interesting also to look at someone who was going to look back at what is essentially a catastrophic failure of what have been identified as a series of very important turns to left populism. And Jäger has been writing, interestingly, about the rise of populism, and also about this idea of ruling the void, Peter Mears ruling the void. So now, having read this book, I'm not sure how much Jäger has actually engaged with the empirical work that led Meir to his conclusions, as opposed to sort of taking on board, because actually lots of people have read Peter Mears' book, Ruling the Void, and I talked about it a lot, but then often it doesn't get much beyond the idea that there is this growing sense of separation between citizens and their political representatives. That's what got me into it. And it was interesting to read, because unlike some people who just want to talk about these left populist projects as the revival of leftism or socialism, he, I think, is correctly identified these people were trying to do something different to the standard radical left project prior to that.
To get into Jäger's book, he starts with around Syriza, right?
I think so.
You actually wrote about that a long time ago as well. Then, right?
Yeah. I wrote about it in Jacobin and on my blog. I took a great interest in it. We even had a correspondent in for Left Flank blog. Kevin Ovenden was doing reports from Athens, because he was living in Athens at the time. Did some very interesting work. One of the things that really focused me on it was that the entire radical left everywhere in the West was obsessed with the possibility of Syriza coming to power in Greece, and of being like the first great breakthrough of the radical left in the post-World War II period. The level of hope invested in it was off the charts. It is hard to remember sometimes how much it was a test of your seriousness as a radical leftist, that you would be supporting this project, and that everyone who wasn't was clearly, obviously, just a dyed-in-the-wool sectarian, whatever reason they put forward for not being enthused about the project. And so I think, it was a really interesting time. Luckily, we were able to straddle the two things in left flank because we actually were serious about reporting what was going on, and had Kevin's often very excellent reports to rely on, but also developing an analysis of our own. And I in the end, put together a couple of controversial posts, one sort of early on in the piece, before Syriza was actually elected, a few years before, when they had their first electoral breakthrough and became the number 2 party. And then later on, after the horrific circumstances of them, being told by the Eurogroup, European Central Bank, and so on, that they had to accept this austerity package, taking a referendum from the people. The people voted against the austerity package, and then the party turned around and implemented the austerity package. And then not only that, went to an election almost immediately, during which their left opposition, which had quit the party in outrage over what had happened, lost all their seats and were decimated. And yet Syriza won, despite apparently having betrayed the population of Greece in the most hideous way possible. So it was, I think, a very important moment. And I think really the high point of this left populism, it's a shame for Jäger that he has to start with the high point and it all gets more dreggy after that.
So
by the time you get to Jeremy Corbyn, it's pretty depressing. And likely he never mentioned the Portuguese. Anyway, I think.
what are some of the other... So Jäger starts with this leftist uprising in Greece that is a response to, it frames itself as a response to the economic conditions and to the kind of imbalance in the European Union.
Yep.
The Greek debt crisis, I want to say.
But it's like the debt crisis of the Eurozone. It was a world debt crisis, clearly. The thing started at Lehman Brothers in New York, and sort of played out, but there was a crisis of the euro. And I think the specifics are important for both the Greek example of Syriza and the slightly less successful example of Podemos in Spain. Both of these, the rise of both these parties follows a period where the Eurozone crisis is being managed, particularly obviously by the German government, in terms of trying to manage this contradiction inside the euro currency project, which is at the same time as there was a European Central Bank setting interest rates, there was no central control of fiscal policy, of government, direct government spending. But you get the situation where each national state within the Eurozone controls its own government spending, even though there's a central monetary agency. So if the central monetary agency is doing stuff that affects all these different countries that are within the euro, then those countries, the idea is you need closer political union, that is closer fiscal integration and making the same kinds of things. And some governments, particularly from southern governments, the ones that are talked about the most, I guess, would be the Irish government, the Spanish government, the Portuguese government, and the Greek government. They all had terrible public sector debts and imbalances. And then the question was, well, why bail these people out when this is a drag on the whole Eurozone, on the whole European economy? And so that was essentially, I think, the crux of it. And the Syriza government came in with a very charismatic finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, who had a specific argument that actually what the richer countries or the less debt adult rich countries in the Eurozone should do is recycle that debt from the southern economies, kind of like a Marshall Plan project post-World War II. That was his argument. You don't have to get into the details of it. Clearly, no one else in the Eurozone thought that this was the case. And I guess worst of all for the Greeks, all the other countries whose governments had accepted terrible austerity and pain, short of having a complete collapse of their political system like Greece was having, those governments were like, well, we've instituted this austerity. Why should we now let Greece off the hook? So they were actually some of the most militant, much more militant than the Germans in a way, in terms of punishing Greece and bringing it into line and saying you must do this austerity to bring yourself in line. And gosh, they were heady days, because who talks about closer political union in the EU now? It just doesn't happen. Like, and I guess partly where I'm living, not exactly the miracle economy that it appears to be back then. That might not be too much detail, because ultimately I think what Jäger picks up on is there is an economic crisis and a crisis of representation. And these political entrepreneurs, in this case from one faction of the radical left, which is where Syriza came from, used populist rhetoric to talk about, well, we're representing the interests of the Greek people versus these unrepresentative political institutions, both at the level of the Greek party system, and like the old Greek parties, and also at the level of the European Union as a whole, these unrepresentative institutions. And so we're representing the will of the people. And one of the things that people on the radical left didn't talk about much, but when I started really looking into the question, became much more obvious, was how early Syriza starts using populist rather than far left rhetoric. There's actually a very good academic article floating around that almost charts exactly the moment they shifted their rhetoric towards populist rhetoric and talking about the people rather than about the workers. It's very interesting that they consciously use this populist rhetoric, but it's also clearly anti-political. They don't just talk about economic institutions, they talk about political institutions.
Right. I saw that actually in Jäger's book. He does mention that, and this is something I highlighted myself really, that Syriza was actually critiquing the political establishments as a whole. And
yes,
that seemed like a contrast actually to the main radical left party in Greece, the Communist Party, which was basically it was more of a large neo-Stalinist sect. So they could not really profit off of this at all. But Syriza could by actually playing on anti-politics. Actually, when did Syriza start to use populist or anti-political rhetoric? When was that shift?
I think it's in a period roughly between 2010 and 2012. And 2012 is when they have their first electoral breakthrough. In between, though, what happens, which I suspect accelerated, which I think Jäger refers to, there's one of those movements of the squares. Everywhere there were movements of the squares. Obviously, the first big ones were in Tunisia to some extent, but Tahrir Square in Egypt. So outside the Western liberal democratic sphere. But then you have a whole series of these movements, whether it's the movement of the squares in Greece, various shapes of Occupy in the United States, and importantly, and I think the most significant of these movements was the 15M or 15M movement in Spain, which actually went much further than any of the other ones of these square movements in Western liberal democracies, in the rich liberal democracies. And it's worth talking about that as well, because I think what's important in Greece is you have a mixture of this movement of the squares, which pulls in, the new middle-class precariat, various, left-aligned people, various, young people, and alongside that, the Greek trade union movement, institutionally, probably a bit stronger than a lot of other countries, and with a kind of institutional routine of always going on mass strikes and having general strikes, but without really having a much deeper sort of rank and file activism that you might have seen back in the 70s or in earlier eras. And so you've got a mixture of these things that I think Syriza manages to relate to, but actually quite limited, like certainly nothing like on the scale of Egypt, which I think, there was definitely a proto-revolutionary kind of edge to that. I mean, in a sense, it was a revolution. They toppled the dictator, even though it was a limited one. And then you have, things like 15M or 15M in Spain, which goes much further. Its tentacles go much deeper into Spanish society. Still not like the radical mass struggles of the 60s and 70s, but something far more impressive. And I think each of these things shapes the response of these political entrepreneurs, but it's not like the political entrepreneurs come out of the movement with the partial exception, I think, of Podemos. But even then, that's the partial exception.
Right. That's actually something I wanted to ask about, because it seemed what happened with Syriza is that there was actually this pre-existing faction of the Greek radical left that was responding to something going on in the street. Whereas with Podemos, it was more of at least in good parts, the movement happens on the streets. It starts to fizzle out. And then Podemos kind of comes into sort of channel it back into the political electoral sphere.
Yes. Yeah, and interestingly set themselves up with a bunch of circulos or circles, which pulled in a large number of 15M activists. So when they set up the party, they had all these local circles. And from people I know, because I spent quite a bit of time in Spain, I had quite a few connections there. And Luke Stobart actually wrote some very good articles in Left Flank about whatever happened to the 15M movement. You can see how Podemos actually directly tries to draw these people in, but very soon they start to control central. They use democracy against the democracy of the movement, in a sense, by having this Congress where it's digitally online, and the votes of the more passive members who are digitally online far outstripping sort of remaining activists further from 15M. And of course, the people from 15M had to accept the Democratic Party we're building. And also, like all these entrepreneurs, they tend to have to be extremely centralized and extremely strategic, because what they're trying to do is be entrepreneurs, to play on something that's going on in society, but without having been in outgrowths of that thing. So if you have a loose organization, eventually it's not going to cope, because because there isn't this kind of mass collective social pressure pushing things forward. You have this situation where you have to have a very clear line to be able to take advantage of, I guess, what might be called an incoherent mass of individual wishes of the population, even the slightly radicalized population. So a population who wants real social change, actually, if there isn't that mass social movement where people start to collectively align around shared self-interest, you have to be an entrepreneur, and you have to look for your audience in different places. Podemos was ultimately less successful for various reasons. The really great strength of Jäger's book is you can like feel the pulls on all the different politicos. It's very empathetic to the politicos running these projects, the entrepreneurs running these projects. You can see the different social pull, including the one pull that Jäger is really good at repeating again and again, which is the one identified by Peter Mayer in Ruling the Void, which is that essentially these are entrepreneurs still looking to avoid. There are no new social institutions that have suddenly grown up during this period of activism that can fill that void. And so, but for Jäger, the critique kind of ends there. And I think that's my big criticism of his book. If he had kind of caught in the same trap these political entrepreneurs are, he can sense that, because of course the void in itself is an opportunity. Who would have thought that this small Euro-communist thing that was the basis for Syriza would be able to win government, on 2 occasions in a row? Who would have thought that Podemos could have, rocketed up the opinion polls in Spain and eventually entered the government as a junior partner? That came from even smaller and more isolated roots. So the void gives entrepreneurs this great opportunity, as it did to Donald Trump. And almost all the entrepreneurs who have a popular bent love to talk about the movement. No one loves to talk about the movement like we've never seen before than Donald Trump himself. But actually, there's not much movement behind Trump. There's certainly a lot of voters who voted for him. But if you look at the actual active movement who are going to do more than get the vote out once every 4 years, it's actually incredibly narrow. Even if you have the most paranoid left-wing view of what Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA represents now, it's actually a pale shadow of the old, Christian right in the 1980s during Reagan. There are no movements in the classic sense, or like in the sense of the People's Party. There isn't like this social upswell that provides a coherence. And therefore they are entrepreneurs. And again, my criticism of Jäger's book is he can sense that tension, but he kind of that's all he sees is that possible field. He can't see the possibility that actually maybe something else needs to be overcome for his hopes for a reinvigorated sort of socially progressive project to be able to succeed and to actually change society. So it's a fascinating book. It loses interest for me as you get to Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, for example, because they like the horizon just keeps getting lower and lower. There's this endlessly diminishing horizon. Now we've got your party in the UK. I can't think of a more depressingly low horizon to be looking at, but and the message there. Nevertheless,
I think many people will not have heard of it.
Your party outside the UK, yeah. So your party is a party formed by some former Labour MPs, Jeremy Corbyn, who was improbably the far left leader of the actual British Labour Party for some period there in the late Tory era, and Zara Sultana, who is a left Labour MP who has also left the Labour Party, and they've come together in a very fractious relationship to set up a new party, which is being called Your Party, interestingly.
Doesn't that reminds me of, remember when Time Magazine made you the person of the year?
Yeah.
That is your party.
Yeah. And so it's quite funny because they've had such a fractious start, and it's clear that the different factions of the organisation have not got their act together, even in that sense of the centralised political entrepreneurs. Nevertheless, they had like 700,000 people put their emails down as expressing interest, which is not insignificant. And it shows you that there continues to be repeated opening of space for political entrepreneurs of all different types. There's just this constant opening up of this space. If you'd said this to people in the 1970s in Britain, that there'll be this major space opening up that is not the Tories or the Labour Party, they would have lost their minds. They would be like, that's not possible. The Tories and the Labour Party have complete lock on the system. Sure, there's the Liberal Party, but it's been tiny since the end of World War One. It's just remarkable. And in country after country where there were a group of parties, either two-party system or in other proportional systems in Europe, a number of parties that represented different social groups, people thought this was locked in, and it's been unraveling over a very long period of time. So the clues about it go back way beyond this period that Jäger talks about. And he recognizes that. And yes, the financial crisis and aftermath in different places did probably accelerate things somewhat. But I think what's missing in each of these cases is the resumption of some kind of coherent social activity on a large scale, even if it's boring institutionalized social activity.
Something I was wondering about too. Sorry, Grant.
We might even be on the same point here. I was thinking about how Jäger is sort of aligned with this left populism, and it's one of the things in his book, one of the difficulties of his book is he's sort of trying to solve the problem for them as he goes along, and just chronicles them not being able to solve the problem, and this sort of difficulty of building lasting organization. And he does turn to Peter Mayer's Void, right? But then he sort of says, he writes, without laying a foundation in society, left populists might turn out to be little more than a flash in the pan. But then the question is, why didn't they do it? Why didn't they lay a foundation in society? And this was something Joe said to me once, was a lot of people read Peter Mayer and they think, oh, well, I'll just make a social base. Okay, the problem is that the parties have lost their social bases, their mass social bases. I'll create a social base. And that's sort of the superficial left populist response to the empirical trends that Mayer is observing.
Right. And I think too, what Ted was talking about with Podemos, that's what actually reminded me of this, actually. The whole, it seemed like they were struggling to sort of get the movement back. Like they actually were trying to it's all, I want to read those articles actually on Left Link now. It seemed like they were trying to pull the strings, but there was a lot of passivity actually.
I'm not sure. I'm not inside the minds of Pablo Iglesias Inigo Errejón or the Izquierda Anticapitalista, the tiny Trotskyist group that was the other sort of founding part of Podemos. I'm not inside their head. I actually don't think they were interested in reviving the movement. I think they wanted to gain political power. In fact, Podemos is perhaps the most dramatic example where you get the entrepreneurs basically say, we have a very short time to win power by smashing through everything with this political message. It was striking. I think they had to rely on the 15M movement. They had all been active in the 15M movement. But I think the Greek Marxist Stathis Kouvelakis has put it, what's the word to use? He said, he talks about how there's these movements, but ultimately you need to have the political solution. It's not enough to have these movements. And of course, as soon as people have the political solution, strangely, they stop thinking about movements. And the reason they stop thinking about them is not because they're bad people, but because the movement isn't there to think about. And they can't conjure it up no matter what they do. And I think it's really key that they can't conjure it up. I think about Jacobin, which often expresses, I guess, the radical internal workings of the mind of the Sanders supporter, the radical Sanders supporter, who is thinking, if we do politics that's about the working class, if we get them involved, then the working class will be doing politics, and that's all we need. I think when they talk about the social base, all they really mean is people to get the vote out for the new political entrepreneurs who will potentially be the new political class to make the change on behalf of the workers. And again, I don't think it comes out of them being horrible people or nasty reformers. How can most people who are involved in politics see beyond this horizon when society has actually been remarkably quiescent for a long time? I have vague memories as a small child, and I'm much older than you guys, of there being constant strikes in New Zealand, where I was growing up in New Zealand, where it was the Bank of New Zealand building was infamous for taking multiple years to be built, even though it was only 20 stories tall, because the workers were always on strike. The unions had a lock on the country. It was a major debate. No one would think the unions anywhere have a lock on any country in the liberal West. Except when they talk about the unions are very influential in ex-Social Democratic Party, and then that party is trying to do Y that we don't like. People on the right will say this, therefore the unions are running the country. But no one really thinks the unions have social power to run the country anymore. As institutions, they're so withered and hollow, and even in countries like in the Scandinavian countries where they have much higher membership, the actual active memberships, the people who are constantly doing, pro-worker collective work is a pale shadow of what it used to be. They're institutionalized in a way, and that represents itself in different ways in different countries as well. So, I think that's the key thing. And Jäger is not to be criticized for not taking the subject seriously. He has taken it very seriously, but there is this low horizon. Even though he's clearly influenced by Marxism, there's no question. All these people on the left are influenced by Marxism at some level. When you look at it, the void is its endless problem. The other problem for Jäger, I think, is that he accepts what many people on the left accept about Mayer's analysis, which is that this was all caused by neoliberalism. And Mayer himself did brilliant empirical work, which stretches back way beyond anyone who even thought of the word neoliberalism. He talks about the history of party systems in the modern era, the bourgeois era, and there is no way he would be dumb enough to claim that it all started when neoliberalism got really popular in the 80s and 90s. In fact, he argues against it in various places. He's not particularly interested in the question of neoliberalism beyond a kind of a policy setting that political classes take up for various reasons of their own. So, because he starts with the material social base of politics. And that in itself, I think, is in all the literature, right wing and left wing, even those who recognize the void, no one really grapples with, beyond Mayer and the people who were closely around him, that politics itself has a material social base. Now, maybe the right wing don't care about this and centrist liberals don't care about this, but you'd think the Marxists would apply historical materialism not just to the political economy, but to the critique of politics. And strangely, almost all Marxists talk about politics the way that all the other political shades talk about it, which is it's just a direct representation of something more fundamental. So on the right, Andrew Breitbart famously said politics is downstream of culture. And so the right often sees it as, well, there's this culture in society, whether it's good or bad, and that's how politics ends up this way. Liberals talk about politics being just a downstream direct expression of the different competing social interests in a pluralistic society. And the Marxists say there's a fundamental class struggle and politics represents pretty directly that class struggle. And for a very long time, when there was a party of labor and a party of capital in many countries, or parties that kind of played that role, and there were large institutions related to, the middle classes and capitalists on one side and the working class on the other, it kind of looked like that, like politics was just this direct expression. And so I think that's part of the confusion, why all the Marxists are actually confused about this, because they fundamentally can't accept the idea that actually politics might be something that is not so directly simply an expression of that society. Even though when they come to the critique of political economy, they can write endlessly about, commodity fetishism and alienation and reification and all these things, which clearly indicate that the way the economy presents itself to us as individuals in the world, that there are processes behind that, which aren't. It isn't just that appearance isn't just a direct expression of what's going on sort of underneath the surface, if you will. That's probably not quite the right way to put it. And yet, when it comes to politics, it's just and so therefore, when you're in a small Trotskyist sect, as I was, or like an unorthodox Trotskyist sect, as I was for a very long time, we kind of saw ourselves as a direct expression of a currently not active but true, pure working class revolutionary movement. We didn't consider the possibility that we ourselves were detached socially, and that our project really didn't connect with anything going on in society, and that the ideas we had in our heads might really be more about our political project and it's sustaining it, rather than actually anything happening in society that might fundamentally transform society. So it's an auto-critique as well, I think, having this point of view.
Yeah. You talk about the decline of social bases, which sort of gets me to the relationship between economics and politics. Like you're kind of getting there a little bit yourself. Like the I think it's very easy to see anti-politics and sort of any kind of populist or anti-system political entrepreneurship, I suppose we're calling it, as about sort of people being squeezed in some way economically, and there is, I guess, a stagnancy economically there feels for maybe the past 30 years or so. But how adequate is that as an explanation for anti-politics? Because for example, when do you see the social basis of politics unraveling? When do you think that starts? Because I think, for me, that actually predates the neoliberal period, as it's called. That predates the recession in 2008, which we could also talk about. A lot of people explain populism and anti-politics through 2008, but there's holes in that explanation. I think Kevin Rudd in Australia is a great example. I know Australia was largely spared a lot of the crisis of the Great Recession and still had all of these kind of anti-political establishment unravelings. But, I think we've even had viewers who sort of say, well, why aren't you talking about the economic side of these anti-politicians, and you can needle the political class on, I think, especially cost of living. So Like, where do you see the relationship between these things? Where does that confusion come from? That thing.
Well, I mean, I'm going to disappoint all those who are looking for something that leftists today mainly talk about. But interestingly, both Mayer and his fellow thinkers, and interestingly, sections of like the Marxist tendency I come from wrote about this as well. In the post-World War II period, you see a dramatic shift towards parties that are more centralized, that appeal much more to the masses through the media and much less through organic connection. Even though they often have huge memberships or are tied to huge organizations. Like in the UK, I think the Tories at the peak had more than 2 million members after World War II. Labour had well over a million plus, many million trade unions. There's a huge social base. And people who are much more active, people who are active at work, in their Rotary Club, wherever they work, people would put out the argument who would feel connected to a political force, identify with a political force. But even in that period, you see the start of the rise of what I get the Mayor people call the catch-all party, which is much more a party where because they're essentially a bit frozen after World War II and institutionalized, these parties are looking for how do we get over 50% of the vote? What other grips do we need to catch within our remit? How do we appeal beyond just we are the party of the unions and the working class? We've got to appeal to these other people. How do the Tories appeal to working class voters? Do they do it through culture and so on? At the same time as you get the rise of greater mass media opportunities to speak directly to a wider section of the population without needing those organic kind of connections at the ground level. So you can even start to see the beginnings of this breakdown then. If you want to go further, there were some shocks that happened in the interwar period. Probably Germany is the most dramatic and horrific example. The leading cadres or cadre of the left, of the social democratic and communist left, they ended up in gas chambers. Like, you want to talk about the breaking of institutions of resistance and representation? Nothing more dramatic than what happened in Germany. So the German political system that arises or is implemented after World War II is really very kind of rigid and top down and institutionalized, and people fit into it because it's not like in the Nazi period there was a complete loss of social connection, and it's rearranged way, but you don't have the same thing where you had like the idea that the Social Democrats after World War II represent the same social institutions and movements that they represented before the Nazis wiped them out. It's just madness. It's entirely different. And it probably explains why things are so pacific, peaceful in Germany after that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've read that the strikes almost disappeared in Germany after 1933. Obviously, that's because of the Nazis, but even after 1945, you don't see a return like what happened even in post-fascist Italy.
That's right.
And it's interesting that Jäger seems to touch a little bit on like this sort of top-down reorganization in the book of a sort of like workers' political class compact.
Yes.
But I think he doesn't quite untangle it as much as Mayer did. And he mentions, like, it gets maybe a little bit smudged a bit. I think he mentions Rzorsky talking about like the left moving from workers to people. But I know Mayer mentioned Kirchheimer on this, who was sort of the main theorist on the transition from the mass party to the catch-all party. And he theorized this in the 1950s.
Yeah, from the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I think it's really important to see that that the anti-politics we have today is the product of a very slow unraveling of something that existed for, in various forms for around a century. And I think what Mayer and others say is correct, that prior to this period, prior to these social forces arising, getting organized and finding representation in the political sphere, there was a similar period of chaotic politics where largely politicians were seen as elite players and entrepreneurs, although they tended to come more from highly propertied classes and not the plebs. But if you look at, countries where there were democratic systems, whether it be the United States or or Great Britain in the earlier 1800s, or even in Australia, in the early parts of democracy in Australia, you see a much more elite kind of political class, less stability, a greater tolerance for differences between different bourgeois factions. That once you have Labor parties, bourgeois factions really need to get themselves together so they can fight these horrible, well, what if the working class really took over? And in Australia is probably the most striking example of that, where there's a complete reorganisation of the bourgeois side of politics out of fear of the Labor Party that occurs in a 10-year period, like a complete upheaval of Australian right-wing politics. So like you can see that it's interregnum, the long interregnum of the mass party era. And that started breaking down in most places almost at its greatest institutionalized peak immediately after World War II. So even in the 70s, you get all those trilateral commissions that are worried about the breakdown of democratic governance around the world, partly responding to the uprisings of the 60s and 70s, but partly also a sense of malaise, both economic and political. Jimmy Carter is like kind of a product of that whole process. I know you guys are particularly fascinated by Jimmy Carter as that kind of figure, and I think that's correct. But it continues to accelerate. Tony Blair is an example of the Labor Party finding a solution to its problems through a type of political entrepreneurship with a mixture of technocracy and populist appeals. You can see the breakdown continues, and depending on the individual party systems, depending on, like, Italy lost its entire party system in the early 90s because of a corruption scandal, and it kind of had the first major collapse. But then things were not so broken down that there couldn't be a recovery, and that, like, the communists could rebadge, the Euro-communists could rebadge themselves as a democratic left. Berlusconi could kind of become both an anti-political and an institutional figure over time. And since then, we've had the collapse of that. And so we've got another collapse in Italy. Like, Italy's a great collapse kind of place. Because even in the peak institutionalized period, where the Christian Democrats totally dominated Italian politics with really no one else running government for a long time, Italian governments collapsed every year. It was bizarre. Like, the government would collapse, yet everything would stay the same. So you just kind of have these kinds of different weird formulas. But now we can see in every Western liberal democracy, and the United States might look like an exception because its party system is uniquely loose and capable of absorbing things or being leveraged or taken over. But really, you can't say that this is the same GOP Democrat based off we had even in the Obama era. Things have dramatically changed. So I think there is a more general process. And each of these shocks, so to answer the question on economics, yes, absolutely. If governments are seen to mismanage economics, they will be punished. But in a previous period, because of this institutionalization, because of its deep social connections of that party system, even though governments would betray their supporters, those supporters would see it as betrayal, and then they would end up voting for that party again. You'd have a small collapse, they'd lose government, they'd come back later. There'd be that cycling, the back and forth that people thought would be eternal in politics. And then importantly, see it as betrayal if their economic interests weren't met, if it was seen to be bad governance rather than outside factors or, a business cycle. And today, who really sees betrayal? Look what Syriza did economically in terms of austerity policies. And strangely, the left saw it as the worst betrayal ever, and then they got in with an equal majority from the same voters who they'd just betrayed. So that people don't even see it as betrayal. Like, they're so distanced from it now. They're so disconnected from politics. It's just another failure by another government.
You talked about that frozenness after World War II and, like, sort of the almost liquidation of social institutions in Germany. But why do you think it's so global?
Because I think if we go back to the start, which is why was there this interregnum of mass party democracy? Because it wasn't there in the early 1800s. And yet, by the interwar period, it is everything. It may be much more unstable because actually the global economy was more unstable. The war had a massive effect, a bunch of dictatorships in countries that are now seen as eternal liberal democracies. Like Germany it was Bismarckian dictatorship. That dictatorship collapsed at the end of the First World War. So you see And then the question is, well, what causes this? And the reason is that the development of capitalist society led to the development of new social groups that had particular connections to the way that society worked. The most important, I think, was the rise of a working class, starting with much more sectional craft unions, but eventually mass unions, the rise of industry, which is like just the progression of capitalism as it's expanded. And you have this proletariat created by capitalism, which then isn't represented in the political system. Even if suffrage comes, which is often resisted, universal suffrage, there's often still property restrictions for quite a long time in the 1800s. But once universal suffrage is granted, political systems have to respond to the threat of these social interests being integrated somehow in the political system. And so I think that, and I'm not trying to say that, therefore, the Australian Labor Party in the early 1900s or the British Labor Party or the Social Democrats in Germany were the direct expression of working class interests. They were themselves, in a way, political entrepreneurs, but they rested on mass movements of people who were relating to each other in completely new ways compared with the pre-bourgeois era, and were coming together in different ways, were brought together by the rise of mass industry and so on. And wherever you read histories of the German Social Democratic Party, they talk about it as a state within a state. Here they are in Bismarckian Germany. It's not truly democratic. They have some representation. They're constantly being banned in various places or censored. And yet there are these workers' reading clubs, Freikultur, nudist clubs, every type of club you can imagine. And they're all kind of bound together politically and represented by German social democracy. Of course, unions as well. The unions weren't perhaps as prominent as some other countries like the UK or Australia. So you have all these different working class organizations, networks, and so on that grow out of the expansion of German capitalism and the changes in German society. And ultimately, the Social Democrats are entrepreneurs. But in the end, the question becomes, are they the direct representatives of that movement? Or are they the people who are the political representatives in an alienated political sphere? But they are responding to something that's real in society in a way that is organically connected, in a way that isn't predicted by the other tendency of capitalism, which is to further atomize us, to further make us, individual monads, to further make us entirely self-interested individuals in competition with each other, entirely egoistic, which capitalism itself, that the market itself kind of tends towards that. It doesn't just tend towards grouping workers together in workplaces. It doesn't tend towards creating institutions all by itself. It tends to actually unravel. The old institutions of the pre-capitalist era were largely unraveled and undermined and so on, and had to, if they were going to survive, they had to adapt. Like churches had to dramatically change to adapt to their loss of, institutional and social strength with the rise of capitalism. So I think if the answer to the question is why has it been happening everywhere, actually, in the absence of this collective movement and collective institution, we now have a prolonged era where we haven't had that. And instead, the tendencies towards atomization have been there, which, of course, some on the left want to blame on neoliberalism, but they start long before that. The breakdown of these institutions can be charted in detail in the post-war era. The heaps of empirical data, both qualitative and quantitative, to indicate this. So I think, it is something about capitalism, but it's not last week's economic crisis.
Right. And Jäger and other contemporary Marxists, I think it gets back to what we were saying about how they want to recreate that social base. But when you look at that history, it wasn't Marxists. I mean, there was kind of a left-wing political leadership role that happened somewhat in the mid to late 1800s, the early 20th century. But it wasn't Marxists who originally created that social base. They politically responded to that social development. I mean, even Karl Marx, right? Marxists don't think Marxists today do not think in the way that Karl Marx thought, right? Karl Marx observed what was happening in society. He didn't go, I think I'm going to invent communism today, and then I'm going to convince the workers that that's a good idea. He saw it as something that was happening and that he was observing, right? And so you'd think the way we would approach, if you were a Marxist, you'd think the way you'd approach things today was, well, what's going on in society first, figuring that out. But that's not how it works. They want to recreate the social base, but that's not what happened the first time around. Even if we even want to talk about it as a repetition.
Yeah, I think too, like what's great about Mir and like and referencing Hirschhauer again too, they point out that even, and you saw this with the German Social Democrats, and even like the British Labour Party struggled with this a little bit as well. The move from like a mass to a catch-all party system, basically, trying to move out of like from a narrow sectional party to, wasn't that narrow actually, but a more narrow sectional class-based party to a catch-all party that appealed to British or German society more broadly. Even like I would think even like trying to move socialism from the platforms, which that did happen in the later half of the 20th century for both the British Labour Party and the German Social Democrats, seemed like a pivot towards that. I think for the Social Democrats, they started to do that in the 1950s. And for Labour, it was quite a bit later, but there was always a question around like nationalization as a platform.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think all these things are responses to the social reality, whether they're conscious or not, as to exactly how those things are connected. I think they are responses to the social reality. So, and in a sense, Blairism is an attempt to solve a problem the Labour Party had, which is the period of the 1970s showed the exhaustion of the trade unions in defending workers' interests. The trade unions got their social contract with the Labour government and turned around and pressed wages. So even prior to Thatcher and the neoliberals, you already have the breakup of the social relevance of that Union Labour Party connection and all those traditions and ideas and policy platforms that are connected to it. And so Blairism is, in a sense, a response to try to revive the Labour Party on a new basis. And I think in the end, that one of the mistakes Jäger makes, it's a common mistake, is to read Mayor through this neoliberal lens, because neoliberalism, of course, in a sense, is there are all these people who wanted to make capitalists richer to respond to the economic crises of the 70s. They had this program of whether it was privatization, globalization, whatever you want to call it, and they instituted this program. And part of what they needed to do was to insulate the political class from popular pressure. And that's where the void opens up. And you see it again and again in Jäger and in other examples. You get the sense that there's the political class going, how can we create a bigger void, because the void will protect us? Even though obviously people say, well, later the void creates its own problems. I don't think it's a conscious process in that sense. In some ways, the void is created simply by the falling away of the institutions, and people are responding to it in different ways. And hence, Mayor talks about populist democracy, that the rhetoric of populism comes up as one of the ways to try to manage that void, but without any interest in actually making things more democratic or involving the people more. But you can speak more to the void in order to win people over to your political entrepreneurship at that time. But I think Jäger's talking about the neoliberalism, and he's not the only one. Almost everyone I've realized now on the radical left who talks about Mayor gets it from Mayor by talking about neoliberalism being the thing that creates the void. Even though the void is clearly something that's gone on for a lot longer and under various different conditions. And I think they do it partly because increasingly also in the long period, politics is no longer seen as really connected with society, but about the machinations of politicians. And therefore it's natural to think, all of these things are kind of conspiracies, whether it be the 1% of Bernie Sanders law. There's like this conspiracy of this minority, of this elite. And then the populist language is useful because it's really an elite conspiracy. And if you had a different elite that really represented the people, you'd overcome the problem. And these things go in circles, I think. So I do think that's an important thing to say, that the void wasn't created by people wanting to make a bigger void. I think politicians, there's an equal amount of utility to having a void and an equal amount of problems. Each different configuration has its own benefits in terms of managing society and its own problems. I think the reason there's so much anxiety, though, is the lack of social base for politics means that everything's much more unpredictable for politicians. They had a sense that there would just be this steady alternation between the right and the left, for example, and this would just go on forever. Yes, we might get thrown out of power. Like the Australian Labor Party was out of power nationally for a very long period of time, from soon after the end of the Second World War until 1972. For a long period out of power, and yet everything seemed incredibly stable. No one talked about the collapse of the party system. People voting for Labor in very large numbers, even though it couldn't get a majority to actually get over the line. It had a split in its own ranks with a Democratic Labor Party that was more right-wing and voted against it. And that led to that. But it was a sense of we'll always eventually get these voters back. It's not like these voters are permanently left us. It's not like the Labor Party cause is a dead issue anymore. We will eventually get back to majority government. But now, no one feels certain about how to get back to things as the way they were. No one feels you could recreate the stability of the past. And I think for the people who are most worried about it, this is a crisis of democracy, not because democratic stuff doesn't happen, not because people don't vote or even sometimes impose their will in really ugly ways on the political elite. It's because there's this sense of how do we govern this? I mean, how do we make it? And, to give Trump his credit, because he is a stand-up comedian / performance artist / creative, his intuition around this, his acceptance of the chaos, of knowing that what he has to do is work out a way to ride the chaos and use it to his advantage. I mean, I think, intuitively, he's kind of grasped some of this stuff, even though he could never really say that. I just can't imagine Trump sitting there and saying, well, I've intuitively grasped the chaos of the moment. But he intuitively grasped that the entire grand old party was ready to be taken. Pretty amazing when you think about it. And then he did it. And he self-funded his campaign. And he spent way less than Jeb Bush. Like, you got to think about, like, he saw how bad the crisis is. The most clever of the political entrepreneurs understand it. And maybe that's one of the other problems that Jäger has is Jäger is a radical leftist. And the problem is the radical left, in some ways, aren't quite really enough to be the entrepreneurs they need to be.
Yeah, that actually...
Why? Yeah, go ahead, Joe. We're probably on the same track here.
We are, but I think... what is it? What I thought you said about... what I thought you said about...
Lies out of you both at once.
Yeah, exactly. What I thought was interesting, actually, like, you were talking about the horizons kind of shrinking on the populist left throughout the 2010s. And I noticed, and Jäger's book actually does document this. I don't think he threads the needle on it, but you can see it. There's less anti-politics, but each iteration that you're seeing in each of these parties, almost. Podemos has it. Syriza has it. You don't really see it in Sanders. You don't really see it in Corbyn. I don't see it in Mélenchon, really. And I think it has to be why they're not as successful.
I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think the thing with Sanders, his clear advantage the first time around, 2015-16, is Sanders was in the position of challenging the fusion of the Obama organization with what was left of the DNC. So he actually, whether he wanted to be or not, had to be against the entire political class. He had to be against the Republicans because he was running for a Democratic nomination, but he had to be against the Democratic political class. So there you see still, like whether or not because he was never an anti-politician before that. There's no evidence he was, but he gets put in a position where he has to be an anti-politician. There's no, and one of the things I think that makes Sanders so frustrating and boring for anyone afterward is that the resistance against Trump, he decides to line up with it rather than challenge it, which actually to challenge it, he might become even more marginal, to be honest. And that ability to be anti-political, run against his own party, even though obviously he's not actually a Democrat, but to run against his own party is not possible. Corbyn had to run against his entire political establishment. Hardly any MPs wanted him. They had a vote to try to throw him out of the leadership, which failed. So he had to pose the activist members of the party against the political class of the party as well. So I think they end up getting forced into, and I'm not as familiar with Mélenchon, to be honest, but you can see the potential for sections of Die Linke here in Germany to play a kind of an anti-political, or they have played a kind of an anti-political role against all the other parties because they were considered like outside the firewall in the way that AfD is now. They're clearly not anymore. Or even Sarah Wagen and her split party, she played an anti-politics. She's not a very good anti-politician, which I think it does explain her failure. But I think that diminishing horizon also comes out of, well, what have they got to work with? And Syriza and Podemos did have the advantage of deep economic crises, a huge political crisis of the Eurozone, and then finally the collapse of party systems that were much more dramatic than what you were seeing in the United States or in Britain. But perhaps the British party system occurs in, I think, March 2019, where the Tories, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats are all on about, and the Brexit Party are all on 25% each. That's when the collapse occurs. And the only reason the collapse doesn't keep progressing, and this is almost at the end of Corbyn, because Corbyn doesn't know what to do about Brexit. And the thing that stops the collapse of the British party system at that point is very simple. Boris Johnson, not at all a populist or an anti-politician, comes in and he recognises the key problem is the lack of representation for this one act, collective social act of voting for Brexit. And he says, I'm going to deliver it and I'm going to smash down every wall possible to deliver it. And he revives the Tories only to have no idea what to do with that afterwards.
So you mentioned Jäger as a radical leftist, and this is a book about left-wing populism. But I think one of its blind spots might be interpreting right-wing populism, maybe as a result. How does Jäger account or not account for the greater success? Well, first of all, do you think right-wing populism has been more successful? To the extent it can still use left and right for all these things.
No, but let's face it, the populists themselves tend to identify that way. With the exception of the Five-Star Movement in Italy, which had a brief birth as a centrist populist party, I would say the jury is definitely in. Right-wing populism has definitely won overall when you look at the arc of things. And of course, the most pressing and disturbing example for everyone on the whole planet who's political and is disturbed by all of this is Donald Trump winning the White House last year, taking back the White House. With a majority of the popular votes, taking all the swing states, increasing his votes amongst decidedly non-white working class groups. All of that is the most disturbing example. But it's true, the votes are going up everywhere. They're not all straight line increases, but everywhere there is a trend that right-wing populism has done well and left-wing populism has done nowhere near as well. And I think Jäger kind of brushes past it briefly, but he really talks very little about right-wing populism at all, which I think is a major gap in the book. Because actually, if you're talking about left-wing populism, it implies there is a larger thing called populism that you need to be considering it as part of and maybe comparing it. But there's very little comparative study in there. So he ends up calling Boris Johnson a populist, which I just find totally bizarre. I try to think of a more establishment politician. But again, every establishment politician can use populist tropes and play on populists, on that division between the people and the elite. So I think that is a weakness of them. And I think if we want to go to Matthew Goodwin's and Roger Eatwell's 2018 book on national populism, and Goodwin is now infamous for an academic who was dared to line up with Reform and Nigel Farage and say that national populism is the way forward. So he's actually become, part of the movement, so to speak. Similar stuff comes up really in their book. A blindness to other forms of populism or a relative lack of interest in them, though has more excusable because the nationalist populism has been a bigger thing of the right-wing variety. And also the same mistake, this constant tension between there is a movement there happening in society that this is the expression of, or maybe there isn't a movement there. And it just comes out again and again. Everyone who writes about this, they cannot resolve that tension for themselves. They point to demographic trends. And of course, the official political scientists, who study the questions of democracy and populism from a very establishment point of view, they point to demographic changes, to clumps of voters who are more overrepresented amongst populist electorates. And then things happen to break down it. So of course, after Trump won the first time, it was the white working class. Even though there were holes in that, what do you say after 2020 and 2024, where he increases his non-white representation and kind of loses a bit in the white stakes, certainly in 2020, right? How did you explain this? Like in fact, the realignments that are happening are not because there are new social forces that are being expressed by these political entrepreneurs. These new realignments are what I call messy realignments. We have a de-alignment. Everyone recognizes there's been a de-alignment from the old parties, but what we've got now is a messy realignment because really there is no collective social weight that would then, and political entrepreneur could then find a stable base in. So I think that's like a really important thing to say out of all this, if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense.
So then why right-wing populism? Why is it more successful?
Yeah. So look, I don't think I have like the complete theory, and hopefully when I finish the revision of this book, I'm going to have some clearer ideas. I think one thing that has happened is that as the working class institutions on which the left based itself and other institutions, social institutions on which the left based itself declined, disappeared, hollowed out, atomized, fragmented and so on. The left, I think, more clung to the institutions of the state. Its programs were more state-based. Like, let's face it, the right has generally thought that capitalism itself kind of is a social force that drives itself. And you can kind of leave things to capitalism, even if the state has to do stuff. So I think actually the left always thought to overcome the problems of capitalism, we need to be tied with the state. And so statism is a very early pathology of left movements that enter politics, even when they're deeply based on mass working class institutions and even radical working class policies. Just think of, I know Trotsky was a very isolated figure late in his life, but he had this thing called the transitional program. We just put this program that again overcomes the gap between where the working class is at and what it needs and what politics will give it. Then people will flock to our small Trotskyist sect because the communists, the social democrats and the other parties can't deliver this. And of course, nationalization is one of the key things in there. And I think that just reflects that in the end, when there is no social base that could transform things, you start to think the state's going to be it's going to be the social institution that transforms things. But the state appears to be the powerful, cohesive, directing force of society when there is nothing opposing it, when there's nothing significant opposing it. So I think that's the main reason. That's my theoretical explanation. And if you look at it, the left's interest in state institutions, and then over time, the left increasingly, trade unions basing themselves increasingly on public sector employees. Actually, those ties with the state get greater the more that the great mass of private society and its business organization, businesses and factories and offices. Once the fragmentation of the working class there occurs, you have less of a sense that the privately employed workers are going to be the great bit of the working class that's going to be a force and change society. That's all kind of by the by. Now, it's going to be hospital workers like me, organized bureaucratic state public health system, which clearly is not going to be the solution to the problem as an alternative to the state. We are part of the state. I'm not trying to say I'm, a functionary of the state in the sense of I'm just blindly doing what the state wants. But there is that kind of concentration. And you just see that. And, I think probably the other reason that the left is increasingly drawing middle-class professionals, cognitive workers into its orbit. In some ways, if there is a social stratum that is really tied to the idea of transforming things through the ability of good thinking people getting in positions of power and changing things, it would be middle class and upper middle class people exactly like me. And to think, well, if we just get in the state and we transform things, there will be, and so I think over time there's just been that fusion. And, Thomas Piketty talks, I think in Capital and Ideology and the papers he wrote before that, how there's been the rise of this Brahmin left, this left made up of quite privileged middle-class professionals, even if occasionally they lose their jobs in, recessions and so on and become precarious. They kind of identify with the new kind of left, which has nothing to do with the old left, which was based on largely private sector, working class organisation. So I think that's the beginning of an explanation. I think the other part, though, is that for any of these left organizations that decide to become political entrepreneurs, and by far the most dramatic example is Podemos, where you could see that people like Anton and Iglesias wanted to break from the left and portrayed themselves consciously as beyond right and left. As soon as that project didn't get over the finish line and take power immediately, the pull of the existing left, which had come in behind them, started to become more and more, to the point that they fused with the old remnant of the Communist Party, Izquierda Unida, to become Podemos Unidos. So they actually fused with the old far-left political class, which, was always on the peripheries. So you see, it kind of gets... Russell Brand. Let's think about Russell Brand. I guess what made myself and Liz at Left Flank mildly famous on the radical left is we defended Russell Brand's attack on the entire British political class, left and right, when the revolutionary left wanted to tell him, you're kind of right, but actually you need to be on the left. You're kind of correct that they're all awful, but you kind of need to be on the left. And they actually, over a period of time, they domesticated Russell Brand, made him totally irrelevant. Of course, in the end, because he's such a pleasant whack job, he went down his own crazy paths, and it's probably a little bit more interesting again, even if it's totally whack. So there's just all these examples where I think the left is so institutional, so focused on those legacy institutions, even though they only contain, the extremely mild residue of a past era of social institutions. They see that as very tied up with the state and with the political class. So I think it's been harder for the left. I don't rule it out as a possibility. The left really, I think, can't base itself on capitalism, can it? It can't base itself on, business being healthy and making the economy tick. So what else can they turn to?
I've wondered too, actually, if the something that right populists have been able to point to is the nation or the nation state as a material fact. It's a lot easier for them than it is for the left.
For the radical left, certainly. But I think it's become harder because there's been a weird kind of globalist ideology that has affected both centre-right and centre-left political classes. That actually political progress is seen as rising above the nation state. And so traditional right has found it hard to adapt to this era. And that's why many of these populist groupings have come from outside the major centre-right parties and in hostile opposition to them. Because to go back to the nation is to go back to the voters of that nation, whereas this whole period of the void, part of what you want to do, I think, of the political class is to lift yourself off this kind of dirty, horrible mess of society of these voters. And not that you'll necessarily make the void worse, but you start to look at, well, what's progress? there's other people just like me in other countries who are also trying to lift themselves off from the mess of their societies. And especially in Europe, we're all part of the European Union, and we all have great institutions where we can talk to each other and organize things and make a better society. We shouldn't underestimate how much it's actually goodwill on the part of these politicians. They believe that whilst society can't ultimately fix, let's face it, it's just a mess. We can be doing these good things in the political sphere. And I think some of the totally crazy stuff around, opening borders, which is like shocking to someone who grew up in past eras where no one either on the right or the left would have considered what Joe Biden did in terms of border policy. You wouldn't even imagine a government could be like that crazy to just take its hand off the lever like that. Suddenly these things just become common sense and a good thing to do, or something we don't like. Cracking down on this would be a bad thing to do, would be morally wrong. And, there's like a certain level of cultural values that unites the political class, which of course, the bit after the catch-all party is the cartel party that Mayor and his collaborators talk about. When political classes start to see more in common with each other across party and partisan lines, and less in common with the bits of society that they are supposedly representing. And then they start to actually create a system to perpetuate their control of the system, even when there's no longer a social base for them to simply alternate in power between each other. And I think that's really important as well. That cartel effect means that there had to be outsiders come into this system to try to take it. Political entrepreneurs rarely come from within the official wings of their parties. And
you mentioned immigration there. There's some empirical data around that you showed us, and this idea of representative gaps. We might have left-wing viewers that will be like scandalized about anything to do with immigration, right? And that's Joe and I have also been talking about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Please.
Look, I'm just going to start by saying my general position is, I wish we had a society where there were, because I still am a Marxist in that sense. I kind of think that, the proletariat has no nation. And ultimately, if you overthrow, if capitalism were overthrown and some kind of communism occurred, whatever the hell that is, you wouldn't have nation states. Like, why would there be nation states? It doesn't make any sense. Nation states maybe make sense for the political divvying up of a world dominated by bourgeois social relations, but they don't necessarily make sense because they didn't make in the feudal era. There weren't really nation states in the same way that we have them now, with attempts at unified cultures, languages, and so on. So I just wanted to say that first. So if people want to cross borders illegally, because there are laws in place, I'm not going to be the person to condemn them for doing so. However, it becomes a huge public policy disaster, which is where I think this article by Günther is quite useful. And he says, quite differently from almost all the other discussions of populism, he says, well, that everyone says the populists say that, we're representing the general will of the people against the elite as unrepresentative, right? And then he says, and those people don't take the next step and say, well, what are voters' policy preferences compared with what political classes give them? And he's done this extremely detailed study, mainly on German data over a long period of time, but also cross-sectional data from many, many Western liberal democracies, and come up with something very interesting. On a series of issues, like economic policy issues, whilst there are fluctuations and differences, on average, voters and politicians are pretty much on the same page, and the policies that get instituted are on the same page. So whilst people don't like inequality and don't like that the working class is, doing better in the system and worry about capitalists being too rich and all of that, actually, when you look at overall public opinion in most Western democracies, people don't have radical views about overthrowing the economic system. They just simply don't. And it's different in different countries, but there's no overall pattern. What he did find is there is an overall pattern on certain what he called conflict issues. And in Europe, that includes issues of membership of the European Union and the relationship of your country to the European Union. Some cultural issues, however, he found no association. So interestingly, he said abortion, right? If you look at the broad view on abortion in the United States, for example, or in most countries, and what policies are and so on, actually populations kind of line up on this. Even though it's a divisive cultural issue in some countries, or have been in the United States, for example, when you look at the average spread of views, it's similar in the political class to what it is. The political class might be a bit more polarized, but similar to the political class to the population, and the policy mix that usually comes out in most countries is the same. But there's a bunch of other cultural issues, particularly around immigration and around sovereignty and around borders, control of borders, and also about the relationship to the European Union, where the political class, both its right and left variants, have moved considerably to the left of where the population is. Population hasn't really moved much to the right, but they have moved to the left of where the population is as a whole, the whole political class, with only a very few exceptions. I think Denmark might be one of the exceptions that talked about in the Financial Times version of explanation of this article. And this is really important because he said, let's take them seriously. If the general will of the people is to be tougher on immigration, for example, or more hostile to the EU taking everything over in Europe, right? Is the political class actually representing or not? And he says, well, actually, they're not. And who are the political entrepreneurs who happen to be representing this? Well, my goodness, guess who it is? It's the right-wing populists. So he says, actually, there is a real gap there. I think there's a limitation to what he says, because he hasn't taken the further step back, which I think is a very valid and important step, to say, well, actually, that question of that gap, the representation gap, doesn't actually represent something even more, which is there is a general feeling that the political class has become detached and representative of the society that it rules over. And so that what he doesn't explore is general populist attitudes in the population, or more specifically, a general feeling of detachment of that type. And one thing we can say for sure is that there are very strong empirical data going back to the post-war period, but really accelerating in the last 25 years, of people feeling not just that politicians don't represent them more in of themselves, but feeling so detached and hostile and so on. But there's actually empirically this rising anti-political attitude, which he doesn't connect with the rise of the right-wing populists. But that's definitely a trend. Now, we can argue whether it's causal or not. I would say it's a bit more fundamental because it's a meta question, isn't it? It's not just a question of, are you represented on immigration and the EU? It's a much deeper question of, are you represented? Are you feeling represented? Are you feeling like this political class has something to do with you? And I think what the populist entrepreneurs play on very well is not just, you're not represented on these policies, though they use those policies because they're a clear point where there is this gap, but they're also saying you're just not represented. The old parties are not for you anymore. And that's definitely part of the rhetoric of a series of these political entrepreneurs, and was of the left-wing populists in their own way, even if I think it was more limited for the reasons we've talked about. So I think the Good article is really good. He's actually saying, take them at their word and let's test it. And actually, maybe the populists are right. But yeah, I think he just hasn't gone the next step, but it's the obvious next step to go, which is to talk about the rise of anti-politics. And there's a whole literature on that, which then doesn't, but almost all that literature outside of Mayer and a few other people dovetails back to, well, how do we fix this problem so that people feel more pro-political? Because we've got this governance problem. Because most of that literature is actually quite conservative and alarmed at what's been going on.
What I feel too that there's something about immigration that makes it a particular tripwire, exactly because it taps into very fundamental questions about citizenship and democracy and rights. Because what is the bedrock of rights and citizenship? It's a contract between civil society that society is more or less agreed on, or its fundamental needs, and the state. And what happens with immigration is You have people that come in who are, they become part of civil society, but the relationship to the political community towards citizenship might not be entirely clear or fully integrated yet. Do they agree on the rights that have already been decided by society? Do they have democratic rights? What does it mean to have, say, the United States, which has a very large population of undocumented immigrants or people who aren't here illegally? What does that mean? What are the implications of that? That you could have people coming in with, that can be exploited for substandard wages and that aren't integrated into the political system, don't have those rights. We are a democracy. It raises all sorts of very hairy questions in that sense, and they can't just be brushed off. They're actually very fundamental to democracy.
If everything else stuff sort of said is right, it is actually about how individual citizens feel, or those seeking citizenship feel about, because in the end, when you're a citizen, you do have a relationship with the political sphere that is more formalized and institutionalized. You get to vote. You have privileges that non-citizens don't have. You have a permanent residence, as Mahmoud Khalil found out. Holding a green card is not the same as being a citizen of the United States. So, there's these different levels of privileges. But one of the things about political classes rising above their society is increasingly they see the massive individuals in society. I think they don't privilege their citizens as much anymore. They're happy whatever works politically is in some ways more important. And if the economy is going well, because there's a lot of low-paid immigrant workers who are undocumented, and the American economy has always run on a much higher proportion of that than many other countries. Isn't this great? Isn't this terrific for everyone? And from their point of view, that might seem so. But what's missing is a sense of, well, I have a loyalty to my citizens because I expect them to have a loyalty to my political decisions. And there's that disjunction that occurs there. And I think that it then really brings home to people. So I think the question of popular sovereignty, which the populists play on, is really important here. Because ultimately, liberal democratic systems are kind of based on the sovereignty of the and the people are usually defined as the citizen, not as the individual, like the concrete individuals of society who have private lives, but in their relation to the state. So I think I think that's why it's become one of the flashpoints. In Australia during COVID, when I was trapped in Australia, one thing that became very clear is that citizenship rights in Australia didn't count for very much, because we were told, first of all, you're not allowed to leave this country. You can't apply to leave this country during COVID. But we have no guarantee. We're not going to send a plane to get you back from another country if you can't get flights, which were really hard to get to because Australia is very isolated. Often, unless you're coming from the west coast of the USA, it's 2 legs to get from most of the rest of the Western world. So like people going to Europe, they were basically told, you may be a citizen, can't guarantee you'll ever get back in the country. So there's this kind of lack of interest in people's citizenship, and that's definitely a flashpoint. That's something that Goodwin and Eatwell really talk about with national populism. They say there's this sense amongst a large number of voters that that compact has been broken between them as individual participants in the process. So I think you're right, Joe. And it's not a real compact. People have always been betrayed, but the sense that that connection is there and that there's some reciprocity is just being thrown out the window in various ways. And I think that's partly why Trump has been able to play on the issue, and why I don't see everyone who wants border controls as an unmitigated race fascist about to bring the new Nazi apocalypse on any country, because I think that's one of the other things is that the left. One of the other reasons the left is so weak on this stuff is they haven't really thought through sovereignty in terms of how a capitalist state is what its sovereignty represents. That's one of the things that's been lost from Marx's critique of politics, in the sense of what is the constitution of the capitalist state that they fell against, would kind of like to run in order to create something different. So, I think that sovereignty question is such a huge question, and the left they cannot see it. They talk about economic sovereignty. What does that even mean when it's in relation to the state? Does it mean Bernie Sanders is the president and runs a different economic policy against the hostile Congress? I don't know. I don't know. But
Well, it's quite funny. We've been talking to socialists about immigration recently, Joe and I, and like I think it's funny too because they'd all vote for Bernie Sanders, and I think Bernie Sanders actually has a harsher stance on immigration than I do. You know, it's a Koch brothers policy, and we can't have open borders and all of that.
Well,
But what was that?
he used to. He's ambiguous now, isn't he?
That's very true.
He's
But
adapted.
I think they would have voted for him when he thought that is sort of what I'm saying.
Open borders people would have voted for him.
Yes. And I think I'm like the problem they run into is that they don't treat it as a real contradiction, and they take their idea of a future socialist, society where there is actually maybe a reasonable way that you could have a free movement of people across borders, right? And they conflate it with a policy position to impose right now, which they wouldn't have to do if, like you said, if they weren't trying to run the capitalist state, which is like what they all kind of secretly, not so secretly want to do. Like there's like a weird, it's all not very well thought out because they will kind of bash the public for not being open borders. But then really, if they took their own theory of Marxism seriously, they wouldn't think that you could have open borders under a capitalist political state. Like that just isn't possible within the paradigm they're in. But they're also not telling people you couldn't have that without a transformation of society. They're acting like you could have that now.
But you see, I live in the European Union where until recently, it appeared that there was free movement of people. I mean, I live in Germany on a Polish passport. So there is at that level, even though the borders are now, there's border checks now, because, things have moved on. But there was a sense in which people felt like it could kind of happen. I've been guilty of it myself. I wrote a blog post once on open borders as a concrete policy, which I think was wrong, because I think exactly the confusion you talk about, Grant, I expressed that confusion on the page without kind of thinking it through. It's different to my position on any individual or family who wants to cross the border for a better life. That's entirely separate position from me going, well, this is a policy that's going to blow up in everyone's face, which is exactly like during the Biden years, I was just mystified as to, I think I have a better handle on when they did it now. I was mystified as to how they could be so self-destructive. But it makes more sense to me now, I think. So I think as these illusions occur, but they're like, they have a basis. The other basis for them is, even in isolated nation states like Australia, you'll have political classes that believe that they are morally superior, even if they, let's say, block refugees coming by boat. They say, but we take in 200,000 new people on temporary work and education visas every year. And how great is that? And how moral are we? So there's a moral aspect to it as well. And of course, you get the contradiction between when you have Australian people who support the Labor Party and its refusal to accept refugees arriving on boats and putting them in camps, who then criticize Donald Trump for doing much less than the United States. So you get all these different contradictions that come out. And I think you're right. They don't really, they just want to move past the contradiction or just accept that the contradiction is there without anything needing to be done about it, rather than actually going, well, what does this ultimately represent? There are clearly lots of people with actual racist ideas who are opposed to immigration of all types or certain types, who have genuinely racist ideas. I don't want to say no one does. Heaps of them vote for left people in left-wing parties, and heaps of non-racists vote for right-wing people who have tough immigration policies. And again, you can't just say all the people with open borders, all the people with the wrong positions vote for the right or anything like that. The reality is messy and people have contradictory ideas in their ideas. What is clear from almost everywhere is there's generally been a general decline in racial animus in most Western societies, a general increase in support for intermarriage and other forms of interracial contact. Even though I guess the sections of the left, you think that's been a bad thing now, but that's a whole another story. And a general liberalization of all kinds of social views. So a mild liberalization of all kinds of social views. Even though alongside it, there's been the rise of these right-wing parties and, declining support for the centre and the left, the traditional centre and the left. So there are these contradictions, and people like eat good and eat well they're really trying to say there's been this rise of nationalist sentiment, this rise of anti-immigration sentiment, for understandable, perfectly non-racist reasons, whatever, because they want to be empathetic towards it, and they may be right. But actually, there's not much sign. There's a rise of nationalist. There was a great study in 2018 that took data over a very long period of time that showed that there is no general rise in nationalist attitudes. There are little ups and downs in certain countries. There hasn't been a rise in interest in nationalism in the general population of most Western countries. So, and that data continues. There's some exceptions and temporary blips, or like this authoritarianism study, which I mentioned earlier. In Germany, they've been running huge survey every 2 years and splitting up the horrible racist East Germans from the West Germans in their data, just so you can see the comparison. And there's been this general trend towards more support for democracy, less support for right-wing authoritarianism, less support for anti-Semitism, until actually a very small uptick in the last 2 years. But actually, let's keep it in proportion, very small. There's been this general trend or flatlining of all these different things, but people are desperate because the political system's breaking down and these new entrepreneurs are rising to say this must represent something in society. And so whether it's the Jäger poll on the radical left or the Goodwin and Eatwin poll on poll of the argument on the populist right, there's this desperate desire to see this as the outcome of something happening in society, rather than the breakdown of politics itself, the breakdown of actual political arrangements.
It's interesting too, watching or reading Jäger. I think he defines populism as, quote, a cross-class expression of expanding democracy.
Yes. Well, there's not much evidence democracy is expanding either, where most of the great battles for democracy were won with the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama called it, in an article people should read, because it's actually much more clever and thoughtful than what most people took from it. But since then, we have this huge rise in the number of democratic states. And there's been some variations. And of course, there's all these people who say, well, there's all these slides towards autocracy. And many of the scales they have, looking at when is a country becoming less democratic, offering it because the liberal institutions that restrain popular will have become weaker. And therefore, there's less democracy. So now democracy is less the demos, the popular will, and more the institutions that hold a check on it. And therefore, democracy declines the less check you've got on the popular will. There's a whole bunch of these scales that people are saying, oh my God, democracy is on the decline in all these countries. Actually, it's actually a struggle within that democratic system between the tensions of the institutions and the popular will. So, but even I'm not saying that is the ultimate fundamental problem. I think that's just become exposed by the fact that long, stable, socially based party systems are with it. And really all of this, if there's a master frame here into which trying to fit this to make sense of this stuff that these commentators on the right or left, who are genuinely trying to understand this, the change, to try to clarify why can't they get over these contradictions? It's this bigger thing. And most of them, or all of them, look back on that post-war era as some kind of golden age in some way. However measured that view is, it's something great. Just democracy was somehow better then. It was more representative. And in one sense it was, in that it was tied to social institutions. In another sense, it betrayed the people in those institutions just as much as it does now.
So if this trend continues, I guess it's an open question where populism is going to go, but we're talking a little bit about populism as a challenger to establishment political classes. But, what is the fate of populism in power? I mean, are Trump and the people around him, for example, are they building a new political class? Because he's got a lot of people in there who kind of weren't supposed to be there in the state. I think in the first term, and this is something our mutual friend David really clarified for me, so I have to give credit there. In the first term, you have a little bit more of that legacy political class in the Trump administration. Now you've
a little bit more. It was full.
Yeah, it was full. John Bolton, the generals, all of that. You've got some eclectic folks who are in this position, and it seems like they're trying to consolidate it, and they don't want to go back.
Absolutely. And in fact, some of this Doge stuff, and like now with the government shutdown, Trump saying, invoking Project 2025 for talking about sacking people. Really part of it is like drain the swamp, isn't it? This is he couldn't drain the swamp because he wasn't prepared. So this time, he and people like Susie Wiles have clearly thought it through. This time, I need to find a way to replace as much of that political class as possible with my own people. And he's had the advantage that in order to get back in power, he had to build a machine. He had to pull people around him. He had to tame little Marco Rubio, who now speaks, equally in national populist terms as Trump does. There's this huge change that he's had to make to bring people on side. Of course, it's not a complete project. The question of populism and power is really interesting because I think there's an idea, well, once enough populists get in power and disappoint their supporters, that's the end of the story. They'll lose. And then the question becomes, what next? Well, the old parties will come back. And in Greece, it looked like that because New Democracy, the old right-wing party, is back in power. So I think it's very changed from what it was before. But I don't think that's quite right. Because ultimately, in the sphere of politics, there is a competition, a bloodthirsty competition that has been reopened. The era of the cartel party is over. The populists are the breaking. They're like sorry, you've had your cartel, we're smashing it up now. And we're going to go back to a system where even though it may not be seen in left-right partisan terms, there's intensified competition between the various political players. And I think we're likely to see all different kinds of configurations, not just people who use populist rhetoric or technocratic rhetoric. I think there's going to be other variations as well that come up. And the key thing now, I think, Trump is doing better than his first term in terms of approval ratings, and actually still ahead of where Obama and Bush 2 were at this point in their second term, interestingly enough, on approval. But what has been achieved? Actually, the Democrats, after keeping themselves alive after the disaster of 2016, are now in such a hole, so tied to such a narrow social base, so confused about what to do. Trump's kind of winning, even though he's not really winning the populist over, but he's winning in that competition. And if you can crush your opponents, you can absolutely crush them by democratic means, by them breaking down and being unable to go on in the way that they used to go on. You can take, you can win again, even though you are an unpopular populist, even though you haven't delivered, until something comes up that to the population seems like a reasonable alternative. I think that's really important because I think people underestimate the hole the Democrats are in. Not saying the Democrats can't win another election or anything like that, but they are in a deep hole that Trump is very good at taking advantage of in that competition. The hole is not of his making. He didn't create the hole. Some people think, Trump did voodoo on them when they collapsed. The hole was apparent with the very fact that Sanders came so close to beating Clinton. The hole was apparent by the fact that Obama had to have his own organization to be able to win in 2008 because the the DNC was not capable of winning elections at that stage, despite the fact that Bush was so unpopular. Those holes are part of this breakdown of the system. And I think what we're going to see is a phase where there's going to be this intense competition. If we look to Hungary, where I'm not convinced that Viktor Orban was truly a populist, I suspect he used a fair bit of populist rhetoric, and he played to those policy gaps around immigration and family values and cultural norm. And also economically, she pork barrel key sections of the electorate that were open to his message. Not the yuppies in the big cities. In that situation, how did Orban hold on to power so long? Well, actually, his opponents were fragmented and collapsed and have no way to respond to the point where Cas Mudde, the world expert allegedly, and actually his PhD supervisor was Peter Mayer, interesting factoid. He argued that the left and the centre in Hungarian politics to overcome the threat of an ascendant right-wing populism in Hungary needed to ally with the post-fascist Jobbik party. So the fascists should join the political class to repel Orban. So this is where people get to when you're trying to defend the old system that has broken down irreparably. You get to these kind of weird configurations. I think it's an interesting thing because all the stuff we hear, because Orban is clearly a model that Trump has looked at. And I think we see some of the same arguments playing out. After Orban came to power, some media private media in the country moved towards him politically, obviously because they saw it was a sensible thing to do. Some were taken over by some of his rich friends. And now we're seeing that play out in the United States. A simple, Bernie Sanders just put out a tweet the other day talking about how Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Ellison, right, are all examples of Trump's friends taking over the democratic free press that we used to have. I mean, he didn't quite put it that way, but here's all these overlords going to control our media and social media, the terrible concentration of power. Now, to his credit, in the past, Sanders used to attack billionaire tech overlords who gave money to the Democratic Party. But Ellison was a Democrat in the Clinton era, and only broke later. Musk was a Democrat until not so long ago. Zuckerberg was clearly in the Democratic camp until very late in the piece, and Bezos was more favorable to the Democrats. Look at the Washington Post, for example. You look at until very late in the piece. So what is Sanders arguing? He's arguing there's an autocratic takeover because a bunch of really rich people decided their bread is buttered politically better if they line up more on the right. Or, in Musk's case, they take on a crusade because they think things are falling apart or whatever. So it's a very weird argument, but you can see everything's being set up for, we now no longer have a free private press. Barry Weiss is now going to be running CBS News. The right-wing takeover, it's all part of Trump's autocratic plan. Like you can see, people are going to say democracy is gone because a bunch of rich people who happen to line up with the left side of politics for a while don't line up with the left side of politics anymore. And you can see how that will be to the advantage of people like Trump, just as it was to Orban. I'm not saying it doesn't create asymmetry, but it's different from a breakdown of democracy. The populism causes autocracy or anything like that.
It's interesting too, though, because this gets to something we talked about before, I think, even about how increasingly democracy is being treated as yourself or your own faction of politics. And nothing else, everything else outside of that is a threat.
Yeah. And it's true for the Trumpians, and it's true for the anti-Trumpians in the United States, for example. They both speak like that. They both speak in existential terms.
Right, like the old cartel party system saw the populists as a threat to democracy because they conflated democracy with themselves. But populists are actually doing the same thing.
Yeah, they clearly say it. Vance has clearly said it. We are more democratic, and he's attacked the Europeans for not providing, for trying to hem in the far right, for the cartel trying to hem in the far right. So, it's a fascinating situation, which shows you something about politics itself. Ultimately, politics can't end up being just one block in a political system. There has to be some kind of internal competition in any kind of democratic system.
Right, but then they wind up creating this weird symmetry in how they operate as well.
But that's the social position that they're in, I guess. And they're all weightless, socially weightless. I mean, whatever talk there is about movement, they're all socially weightless. And so it really is about the battle within the sphere and how do you gain advantage in that battle. And it's like bringing out the shock troops of the social base is not possible anymore. At best, you subcontract part of your electoral operation to Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, and they get out some of the vote. And it's this, people talk a lot about Charlie Kirk's ideology and his debate and blah, blah, but actually maybe he has the greatest ever impact on American politics with getting enough vote to really seal some, resounding win back last November. And that's an organizational thing. It's still not on the scale of the religious right in the 1980s, who brought out millions of people, regularly for Reagan.
You mentioned this on this subject of political parties, both establishment legacy political parties and populist parties viewing attacks on themselves as attacks on democracy. It's almost as if wherever there are political parties, each party will attribute every defect of society to the fact that its rival is at the helm of the state instead of itself. Kind of like that.
Even the radical and revolutionary politicians.
Right on.
Of course, Grant has closely paraphrased a quote from Marx. I think from Critical Notes on the King of Prussia and Social Reform, which is available in the Penguin edition of Marx's early writings. Now it's a very, very key insight that Marx had, I think. The problem, I think, is that the politicians can only see the world, the point of view of their social position. And so they would have to literally think, well, maybe we need to obliterate ourselves as a socially organized space within society in order to fix this problem. So it's better to externalize the problem. And, people like Tucker Carlson, for all his wackiness and his politics and so on, he often talks about how much of politics on the left is projection of exactly the thing that I'm doing to you, I'm accusing you of doing to me. Of course, you can flip it. The right wing does it as well. And I guess Tucker Carlson plays the same game. But it's actually, that is how it ends up being. They end up seeing it that way. That all these problems come from the outside. All these are pathologies. And in fact, the most radical Marxists, with very few exceptions, still kind of accept this idea as well, that in a sense, politics isn't like that it really is just representative of some other struggle or some other thing, and you can leverage it to somehow transform things, and that it isn't just this. And in the end, I guess that's why Marxists end up becoming pissed off with the working class, because it just doesn't live up to their expectations of the revolutionary proletariat. Yeah. Just like the voters. In the end, the voters piss off all the politicians because they don't live up. They don't live up to it. And like the best entrepreneurs, like Trump, are very good at not criticizing the voters. Unlike Hillary Clinton, who called them deplorables and desperate. So like the very most sensible entrepreneurs understand your rhetoric can't go to blaming the people. But there are lots of people who lots of Trump voters, I'm sure, blame other people for not voting Trump. But it's always external to this, because politics is the only place right now where it appears that we can do anything about the issues of society as a whole. Do you feel that you've covered a lot of things there?
I feel we've covered a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a ridiculously long podcast. People are going to fall asleep about 20 minutes into it.
There's a way we want to wrap this up. What do you think, Brittany?
Well, I could make one last very brief statement,
Sure.
Which is, if you edit all that other stuff together, one of the things that comes out of everything I've been saying is that this process of breakdown is likely to continue. The chaos is likely to increase. New political entrepreneurs are likely to rise in the most unexpected situations as the old ones fail to be able to hold themselves together. I think the recipe is for more of the craziness in various forms, including forms we can't yet predict. And I think that's really important, because for anyone who's been on the radical lecture as a project of, I guess, working class self-emancipation and the overthrow of capitalism and its state, That's a very important thing to think about, because if your starting point is how do we find a political project that's going to be able to get through all this without having an actual social movement to do all this work, it would suggest that you are entering a highly unstable world where you're going to be buffeted in a million different ways, and the chance of more than transient success is going to be extremely low, even at a very superficial, vague and electoral level, let alone actually having the social power to make major changes in society or even major changes in state policy in the way it affects working class people. So I think, the radical left has lost this and has lost Marx's critique of politics, perhaps a very long time ago, reflecting on it now. Actually recuperating that might give us some clues as to what projects not to get into, which end up being, like Anton Jäger's book kind of documents, highly self-destructive. Briefly exciting, highly self-destructive. Have the working classes of any of those 5 main countries he's talked about come out better because of those projects? I don't think there's any evidence. And it's just simply looking to the wrong place in society for the solution. Yeah, that's my wrap up. Maybe know why you've never had me on this podcast, because I talk too much.
No, it's great.